Our prayer for the morning is taken from the prayers of the late, great prophet, Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. Please join me in a spirit of meditation and prayer. O God, people in all nations and in all cultures call you by different names. Some call you Allah, some call you Elohim, some call you Jehovah, some call you Brahma, some call you the unmoved mover. But we know that these are all names for one and the same divine Spirit. Grant that we will establish in our lives and in this world a kingdom of mutual understanding, a community where people will live together as siblings and respect the dignity and worth of every human being. Grant that we wage this struggle with dignity and discipline. Help us in the moment of difficult decision. Help us always to seek that which is high, noble, and good. Grant that we will go on with the proper faith and the proper determination of will, so that we will be able to make a creative contribution to this world. These things and many more together in the silence we now pray. Andra moena pamusa pelutropos hos malapola, plankthe pe troies hierom ptolie throne per se, polon danthropo idanaste akaino onegnon, polod egen ponto pathanalge ahon katathumon, arnumenos ein nansukein kai noston et tyron. Thus begins one of the oldest and most influential stories in all Western literature, Homer's Odyssey. 2 months ago, I mentioned Homer's Iliad in a sermon that focused on Edhedwana, a high priestess in Mesopotamia during the 3rd century BCE, who only now is being acknowledged as history's first named author. Until recently, if you had asked the identity of history's first author, the answer probably would have been Homer. Homer composed the Iliad and its sequel, the Odyssey, nearly 3,000 years ago. Together, they comprise about 28,000 lines of poetry, set in a meter known as dactylic hexameter. Epic in length, encyclopedic in scope, and wildly popular in their day, the books cover a 10-year battle between the Greeks and the Trojans, known as the Trojan War, and the aftermath of the war. As you may recall, the Greeks laid siege to Troy because a Trojan warrior named Paris stole the wife of the Greek king Menelaus. Her name was Helen, and she was reputedly the most beautiful woman in the world, the face that launched 1,000 ships, as the idiom goes. In response to the theft, a flotilla of Greek ships filled with warriors sailed to Troy to reclaim Helen and destroy the city, which they eventually did. The Greek warrior Odysseus, king of the Greek island of Ithaca, played a pivotal role in the victory. He reconciled 2 feuding Greek generals, and he also came up with the idea of a hollow wooden horse, the so-called Trojan horse, which he secretly filled with Greek warriors, then placed outside the city walls of Troy. Intrigued, the Trojans brought the horse into the city, whereupon the Greek warriors emerged from the horse and opened the city gates to the Greek armies outside. The Odyssey describes the aftermath of the war for Odysseus. It took him 10 years to make his way back to Ithaca. Along the way, Odysseus had many adventures and misadventures, some of which showcased his prowess as a warrior, while others demonstrated his foibles as a human being. 6 years ago, the classicist Emily Wilson, a professor at the University of Pennsylvania, published a new translation of the Odyssey, the first ever by a woman. In discussing her translation with the New York Times, Wilson said, "The first major decision a translator has to make is how to translate the last word of the first line." The first word of the Odyssey is man, referring to Odysseus, and the last word of the line is polutropos, an adjective that modifies man. The 12,000 lines that follow are going to be about a polutropos man. What kind of man was Odysseus, who wandered for 10 years on his way back home? The prefix poly means many. Tropos means turn. Odysseus is a man of many turns. So the question, Wilson says, is whether he's the turned or the turner. Odysseus has been to Troy and back and buffeted it all along the way, with gods and goddesses and monsters turning him off the straight course that ideally he'd like to be on. So maybe he's been turned and buffeted by others. Or, Wilson says, maybe he's an untrustworthy guy who is scheming and deceitful in turning situations to his advantage. So maybe he's the turner. What is Homer ultimately saying about the character of Odysseus? Before I learned to read the Odyssey in Greek, I read Robert Fitzgerald's translation, which translates polutropos as skilled in all ways of contending. This description makes Odysseus an ancient James Bond prototype who can go up against any opponent and ultimately win both the battle and, along the way, the collusion and affection of the woman as well. Other translators have made other choices. Some accentuate Odysseus' positive qualities: crafty, sagacious, versatile, while others focus on his negative qualities: shifty, restless, cunning. For her part, Wilson says, "I wanted there to be a sense that maybe there's something wrong with this guy. You want to have a sense of anxiety about this character, that there are going to be layers we see unfolded. We don't quite know what the layers are yet. So I wanted the reader to be told, be on the lookout for a text that's not going to be interpretively straightforward." The opening passage of the Odyssey invokes the muse. In Wilson's translation, it reads, "Tell me about a complicated man. Muse, tell me how he wandered and was lost when he had wrecked the holy town of Troy, and where he went and who he met, the pain he suffered in the storms at sea, and how he worked to save his life and bring his men back home. He failed to keep them safe. Poor fools, they ate the sun god's cattle, and the god kept them from home. Now, goddess, child of Zeus, tell the old story for our modern times. Find the beginning. Wilson chose complicated, she says, because it hints at the original ambivalence and ambiguity. It asks, why is he complicated, she says? What experiences have formed him? Which is a very modern kind of question and hints at there might be a problem with him. She adds that she wanted it to feel like something you might say about someone today. They're complicated. But why should we care? Hasn't the Eurocentric Western canon served as an instrument of intellectual imperialism to exclude and oppress people from other cultures? Indeed. Which is why the study of the classics has become a battleground between those who champion European intellectual traditions and those who see them as an obstacle to progress toward cultural equality. Last month in the Washington Post, two black classicists, Angel Adams Parham and Anika Prather, addressed this struggle from their perspective. They teach at the University of Virginia and Johns Hopkins, respectively, and they have co-authored a new book titled The Black Intellectual Tradition, Reading Freedom in Classical Literature. They begin by pointing out that Christianity, often identified with Western European colonizers, is not itself an inherently white European religion, unless, they say, the Middle East and Northern and Eastern Africa, seedbeds of the faith, have suddenly been recategorized as part of Europe without our notice. Parham and Prather point out that the principles of classical antiquity emerged and flourished around the Mediterranean Sea, the crossroads of Europe, Africa, and the Middle East. The impressive exchange of ideas continued across the barriers of time, religion, geography, and culture. Herodotus' histories 2,500 years ago described real and fantastical stories from Central Europe to India to Ethiopia and beyond. For more than 500 years, beginning in the 8th century, scholars at the library in Baghdad translated the masterworks of Greek philosophy and mathematics into Arabic. These included Aristotle's treatises on democracy, virtue, and happiness. Jewish and Christian scholars made pilgrimage to the library, eager to read these classical texts that had been lost to the West. Their discoveries in Baghdad reinvigorated Western learning. Fibonacci returned to Italy from North Africa armed with Hindu-Arabic numerals. Thomas Aquinas read commentaries on Aristotle by the Islamic philosopher and scientist Averroes, and so on. Parham and Prather also point out that many influential Black American intellectuals eagerly participated in this conversation. Revolutionary War-era poet Phyllis Wheatley, abolitionist Frederick Douglass, and NAACP co-founder W.E.B. Du Bois among them. Rooted in the fullness of this history, they say, classical education invites us and our students to learn from this rich crossroads and to enter into a millennia-long conversation about what it means to be human, the essence of freedom, how to live well, and what constitutes a good society. They conclude with a story about an educator named Marva Collins, who founded Westside Preparatory School in 1975 for underserved families in Chicago. Collins taught her students from the classics, opening their minds to understand not just their own story, but the universal human story. Collins encouraged the children to look beyond their difficult circumstances, saying, "You must become citizens of the world, like Socrates." 10 years ago, I spent a week in Afghanistan with several other members of the Council on Foreign Relations. Our visit coincided with the end of the surge and the beginning of the initial drawdown of troops. We were able to see the dramatic gains that had been made, especially for women and girls, but also the peril that lurked if the drawdown happened too precipitously and too completely. Tragically, Washington politics trumped both the strategic wisdom of the generals and the humanitarian wisdom of the NGOs. Many of the gains have since been reversed. My most distressing experience in Afghanistan came during dinner one night at the Marine base in Helmand Province. I dined in the officers' mess with a colonel who had previously been posted to Washington, D.C. One of the responsibilities of his office was to ensure that all the newly elected members of Congress, both senators and representatives, had valid U.S. passports. He told me that during his 2-year tenure, 110 new members of Congress had been elected. How many of them had passports when they were elected? 7. How many of those passports had been used to travel outside the United States? 2. To be citizens of the world, we need to read about the world and its history, study its literature and its culture, and travel among its diverse peoples. What we discover is that it's complicated. The world is complicated, economies are complicated, politics are complicated, and people are complicated. One reason I immerse myself as much as I can in the work of the Council on Foreign Relations is to remind myself of precisely this point. Clergy often find themselves in the world of the great prophets, who issued relatively simple commands about how we should live. Moses and the Ten Commandments, Jesus and the Sermon on the Mountain, Muhammad and the Quran. People who follow these commandments are viewed as good, and people who don't follow them are viewed as sinful. It's easy to get seduced into this simplistic way of thinking. The truth about life and people, as well as about nations and history, is that it's more complicated than that. This is worth remembering not only if you are a military strategist, politician, or pastor, but also if you are a complicated human being trying to find your way home, wherever that is. We are each more complicated than anyone around us knows. We need to remember that about ourselves, and we need to remember that about other people. Everyone you meet has struggles you don't know about, worries you can't fathom, failures you haven't witnessed, fears you haven't felt. They also have commitments you can't see, hopes that remain hidden, and aspirations you don't know about. If we remember these things, we will become better able to help each other find our ways in life. We will become better people and a better community, and we will become better citizens of the world. Amen. I love you. May God bless us all.